And we are live. Welcome to another episode of the New York Information Security Meetup. And I have the great pleasure to introduce Mark Rasch, who is of Corman, Jackson, and Krantz Legal Counsel. How are you, Mark?
I'm good. How are you?
And not just that, you are an expert in cybersecurity, and not a self-proclaimed one. Just looking at your background, you've done so many things, and you've done tremendous work in cybersecurity. But you didn't always do that. You were basically working with persecutors, right? So you were in front of the court doing legal work, right?
Well, in fact, I started my career as a prosecutor with the Justice Department, prosecuting white-collar crime cases. I prosecuted mafia cases. I prosecuted espionage cases. And then one of the cases I worked on was the first computer hacker case, which was the United States versus Robert Morris, who created what was called the Cornell worm or the Morris worm that basically shut down the internet for about 3 or 4 days. So that was one of the first cases.
And it's incredible. Like, that's basically paved the way. So let's talk a bit about that. So what happens, and this is, I love to kind of peel the onion on these things, because most people don't realize that whenever there's a kind of a new case, things that have never done before, never happened before, you are basically, you have to pave the path. There's no, typically in the court of law, there are, previous cases that rely on, previous outcomes and so on. But that wasn't the case. You had to basically reinvent the kind of the legal framework around what happened back then. So talk to me about that for a little bit.
Sure. One of the interesting things is trying to figure out, first of all, what is computer crime? Why is computer crime different? Do we need new laws to deal with this, or are the existing laws sufficient? So we tried to pattern the computer crime law, which at that time was the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, off of regular crimes, but say things are different on a computer. I'll just give you one example. We understand what the law of trespass is. Somebody breaks into your house, somebody breaks into your car. That's trespass. What is trespass on a computer? Well, there's no physical location there. There's no there. And so how do you trespass in a computer? And it gets to the question of authorization or authority. So you say, okay, if you access a computer without authorization, that's a trespass. Well, what's a computer? Is my wristwatch a computer? Is my phone a computer? What does access mean? If I send you an email, have I accessed your computer? Okay. And then what does authorization mean? What about if you work for a company that says no personal use of our resources, and you check the Yankee score? Is that without authorization? And does without authorization mean without any authorization at all, or without being authorized to do what you're doing? Or are you authorized to use the computer but not authorized to use it to do this? So you try to pattern it off of existing law, and you create a whole bunch of problems.
Oh, for sure. Because Mark, just thinking out loud and just hearing you say that, not all the time you can take that leap, from an existing. So, if you look at, like a car versus horses, right? So, despite the similarity that all, they both were used for commute, like taking whatever laws responsible regarding the horse commuting, like, was not necessarily applicable to vehicles, which are, way faster moving. There's all the technologies. And the same goes for, as you mentioned, in the kind of the cyber world, defining what a breach is, or what is, like intrusion to your surrounding is very, very different. So how did you go about that? Like, first you have to define what is the most similar in nature, right?
Right.
And then you have to take that and try to build a framework. But laying that groundwork, like, where do you even start? Like, was this a monumental thing to do? Like, I mean, it must have been.
It's a continuous thing. Yeah. So, for example, as you pointed out about the horse to car, now car to self-driving car.
Right.
So you have exactly. What is the law of self-driving cars? What is it going to need to be? We get into questions about privacy. We get into questions about access, data ownership, rights to data, things like that. What does it mean to steal data? When I steal your car, you know it because there's no car there. When I steal your data is still there. So what do we mean to steal data? So what we do is what we try to do is go back to pre-existing principles, just basically bad stuff. Okay, this is bad to do. Trespass is bad because it interferes with people's property and privacy rights. Theft is bad because it interferes with their ownership rights and their right to use. Theft of certain things is bad because it interferes with their privacy rights and self-integrity rights. So we have certain basic things that we know that are bad, like murder and assault and larceny and theft and fraud. We know those things are bad, and we say, let's take those principles and apply them to the new technology. A simple example. I get your user ID and password, and I log in as you to some database. Is that a crime?
Well, I would ask the question is, what have you done after because I don't even know if, well, I think it's a crime to begin with because you're assuming somebody else's identity, right? So that's by itself.
But are you? Is a user ID and password an identity document, like I'm holding up my card and saying I am David? Or is it a key, which is I'm using David's key to get access to someplace? So the first problem we have is just defining whether this is an identity document or is this an access document. And they're intertwined with each other because we are allowed to have access because of our identity. But the law is different. One is false personation, I'm pretending to be you, and one is unauthorized access or trespass. And even that law gets muddied up when you're talking about electronically.
Right. And you're building upon it, right? So it's the foundation, right? And then you build upon that the kind of the outcome of that, and it's really critical to have the foundation right, to make the right assumption right at the offset.
And we often don't. And so, for example, what I was talking about before about the question of authorized access or unauthorized access or exceeding authorized access, we've been building on that since the first Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which was actually in 1982. And we've been building on, first we had the idea of unauthorized access, and we had exceeding the scope of authorized access, and we've been working on that for prosecution. So what happened in a case before the Supreme Court 2 years ago was that you had a Georgia state trooper who was using his authorization to access the Georgia criminal database for personal purposes, okay? And the database said, you may only use this for law enforcement purposes. But he used his own user ID, his own password. He had access to the database. He obtained the data, and then he used the data for personal purposes. And the question was that exceeding his authorization to access? Well, the sign, the virtual sign, said you may only access this database for law enforcement purposes. So one way of looking at it is saying, look, he accessed the database without permission or in excess of his permission, and therefore was committing the crime. The other way to look at it is no, he was allowed to be there. He was allowed to access the database. He was allowed to take the data. Once he took the data, he used it for an improper purpose. That you can prosecute him for that, which is like converting government property to his own personal use, but it's not unauthorized access.
And Mark, and I'm assuming those two are very different also from an outcome perspective and the kind of the fines or the repercussions, right?
Well, there's a big reason why the second one is problematic, and that has to do with employees of a company who are authorized to be there, but who have signed an NDA or non-use of data. They get data off the computer, and let's say they start a competing company and they start to use the data that they took from their previous employer to compete improperly in violation of a contract. So they've gotten the data lawfully while they work for the company, but they use it in violation of the contract. Ordinarily, you sue them for improper competition, breach of contract, things like that. Under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, if you interpret the statute to mean exceeding authorized access, which is getting data you're allowed to get for an improper purpose, now suddenly you've made this a crime.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And insider risk is like one of the pillars of risk associated with with cybersecurity. It seems like because of the elevated access and privileged access for employees to resources. I have so many questions. Hopefully I can keep them all in straight order. But let's talk a bit about the NDA piece component of it, because that was, I'm sure a lot of people are curious about that. So I've heard somewhere where, most companies have you sign an NDA, especially when you're dealing with sensitive information. But then, the issue is when you move to another role, a lot of times the hiring practice is such that you are typically hired for the job you had, the same role you had, and potentially at a competitor. That's just how it is. And
that's no problem doing that. I mean,
okay.
It's up to you to self-police. Okay. It's up to you to ensure that you don't violate the non-disclosure agreement and things like that. And it is bad form, and maybe even actionable form, to take data from one company and use it for the next. But the problem is that computer crimes are crimes against information. And in fact, calling them computer crimes is, in my mind, a little bit silly, because the computer is just a vessel. The computer is not the victim of the crime. It is often the instrumentality of the crime, but it's just the vessel. It's the information, confidentiality, availability, and integrity of information that we're.
So why don't we call it, Mark, information crime?
We do.
Okay.
We do.
Well, we do, but computer crime has been used in the popular media for so many years.
It's like the prefix cyber. It makes things sound a little cooler, So cyber. I hate when. Oh, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm cyber. Cyber is not a word. Cyber is a prefix. Okay, and so cyber can mean cybersecurity, cyber, lots of things.
Yeah, you live and die by the words. That's your profession as well.
That's right. But I'll give you a problem about like information crimes. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if I go into your office and you've got a bunch of papers on your desk, and I'm sitting there, and you say, "Hey, can I get you a cup of coffee?" And I say, "Sure." So you go to get me a cup of coffee, and while you're gone, I read your copy of the New York Times sitting on your desk. Have I committed a crime? Probably not. Did I steal the paper? We put a difference between reading something and taking it. If I take the paper and put it in my briefcase, mm-hmm. maybe I've committed a crime. And there's a difference between the New York Times and some document marked confidential and some health records and things like that. We put different categories on different kinds of crimes. We put different categories on confidentiality, availability, and integrity in the physical world. In the electronic world, just looking at something, just seeing something could also be a crime.
Wow. So how do you prevent that, or should I say, how do you even prove that somebody saw it? Because a lot of times there's no trace, right? If you click on an email and you view it, not always like you have the ability to prove that the email was read.
That's right. Well, okay. So what we do is we put access control on, we put authentication on, we put encryption on. So to a great extent, like for example, let's say you're walking through the woods, mm-hmm. and somebody grabs you and says, "You're under arrest." You say, "For what?" They say, "Trespass." You say, "I'm just walking through the woods." He says, "Yes, but it's my woods." You say, "I have no way of knowing that." The same thing is true on the internet. There's no boundaries. There's no locks. There's no natural borders. And by the way, there's no natural borders with countries either. And so we have to impose that kind of boundary. We have to say, this is what you're allowed to do. And we typically do this through these 20-page terms of service or terms of use or end user license agreements or software license agreements.
Which nobody reads.
Because
it's impossible. Imagine that you had a EULA like that, when you install a software or whatever the case may be, and in order for you to click next, you have to read through a 20-page, you have to scroll down 20 pages.
And that's what people do. They just speed scroll down and they click yes. And now what you've done is you've agreed to all these terms and conditions. And now violation of those terms and conditions potentially becomes a criminal offense. That's absurd.
So how do you protect yourself? I mean, that's the case also when you sign up for services. And you click agree and you create an account. There's some stipulations in terms of how to use it, and you have to agree in order for you to make the account. And then they also change. Here's another thing, Mark. Like how many times you've signed up for a service and then you receive an email, a very bogus email. Oh, there's some changes to terms and conditions.
And they don't even have to do that. They say continued use of our website after we've changed the terms and conditions constitutes acceptance of the change. It's like,
nuts.
It's like Darth Vader and I have altered our deal. Pray I do not alter it again.
And I love your example of the woods because it makes it like clearer. So it's almost like, okay, you walk in the woods. If you take the same example, and now the boundaries have changed on you, or it's somebody else's woods now because it's like you're still walking the same woods, but it's the rules of engagement have changed because it's now somebody else's forest.
And I'll give you another example. Let's say you have a long URL that says www.company.com/files/folder 187. Okay, I just made that up. And you click on that, and it takes you to a document. And you say, you know what? Wonder what happens if I write folder 186. Change the 7 to a 6. Click, takes you to a different folder. Okay, no protection, no password. Okay, but it's not what you were given access to. And this is some private folder. Have you trespassed?
Yeah, that's almost like the classic SQL injection, like in a simpler format, right?
So there's this theory that if I can get to it, physical ability to get access to it, then I'm allowed to get to it. All right? And so in order to create limitations, we have to actually impose them physically and electronically. And even then, we end up with these end user license agreements and nobody reads. So how do I know you're not allowed to go to my website and trash everything? Well, you agreed not to.
And Mark, it's one thing to declare the issue and bring it out to the open, but we have to provide some sort of like solution for it. So it's not like the commercial where somebody like the security guard is telling you there's a crime, but is not doing anything about it because it's not their role. So what do you recommend, Mark, for somebody who's an expert in this space, but also has the legal capacity to understand? What do you recommend for companies to protect themselves, and as well as individuals to when they're looking at these EULAs and they're looking at these services, and you mentioned that things have changed, and it's such a moving target as well. Like things have changed so quickly in this space where nobody, even people in this that do that for a living, have a hard time keeping up with everything.
So because the law is ambiguous or shifting, we need to have a mixture of legal protections and technological protections. Mm-hmm. And so an example, you're walking in a parking lot and there's a car with the engine on, and there's somebody's purse on the front seat. And you open the door and you just put the purse under the seat so it doesn't get stolen. Is that trespass? And the answer is probably not. You're trying to do a good thing for somebody. So we have this body of social norms and behavior that we have built up over thousands of years of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Is it acceptable for you to walk into your neighbor's house? The answer is it depends. Why are you walking into their house? What's the purpose? That kind of stuff. We broke that a lot when we got to the internet. And so this idea of, is it legally acceptable for me to pen test somebody else's network, to look for vulnerabilities? Is it legally acceptable for me to exploit those vulnerabilities if I find them, even if my purpose is a good purpose? Those types of things.
So you're trying to do, make them them a favor by finding exploits in their network and say, okay, this is what you need to fix.
Yes, exactly right.
Almost.
And if there's a formal bug bounty program, we can say yes. If there's no formal bug bounty program, the answer is I don't know. I honestly don't. Is that when I'm doing a pen test, am I walking to your house and jiggling the doorknob, or am I sitting there with a crowbar smashing the windows? And the answer is it depends on how far you go. So the first thing to remember is that information security is necessary to define what is acceptable and where you can go, create borders. The second thing is to categorize information. public, non-public, sensitive, that kind of stuff. And you're categorizing information not only based upon its public accessibility, but upon what rights come with that data. The reason healthcare data is protected, your hospital record is owned by the hospital, even though you think of it as your records. It's not. It's the hospital's record. But even though you don't own it, you have privacy interests in it. So we're creating this whole body of law of data that belongs to one person, but we have rights in it to another person. And that includes server logs, access logs, personal data, health data, massive amounts of data like your search history, things like that. Doesn't belong to you. It may be held by Google, but it reveals personal information about you.
Do you know, Mark, that bracelet you can get in case of death? Delete my Google history.
Yes, exactly. Well, if I wrote an article years ago for Wired magazine where I talked about the requirement for a digital will to dispose of your digital access, including access to files and access to social media and all that in the case of your death. And now a number of the social media sites allow you to create that as well.
How many people do you think actually go ahead and think it through and do it?
They don't, but here's what happens. You have somebody who's killed and the family wants to get access to the pictures, okay? Their personal pictures and stuff stored there. And they can work with the social media companies who are much more responsive to doing that. And courts are a lot more knowledgeable now about these types of things than they were in the past.
Yeah, and speaking of knowledgeable, again, looking back at the kind of the initial cases where, we're dealing with, information crime. Back then, today, like you talk about people about like, hacking and passwords and, and social engineering and so on. And people kind of get it, even people that are not in this space. But back in the day, there was, I'm assuming it was quite a challenge to deal with judges that have, zero clue, as well as potentially with, if you have witnesses or people that are, part of the legal proceedings, and they're very clueless because they've never encountered that. How did you overcome that?
It's funny you mention that because I went back and I reread the transcript of the Morris trial. By the way, the Morris trial was not the first case I had worked on. That was a computer hacker case. That was what's called the Cuckoo's Egg case. And that was the Hanover hackers who were hacking into various military and government computers to try to steal information about the Strategic Defense Initiative or Star Wars program. But it was interesting because we only had one juror who had ever used a computer. And she
I'm
worked.
Sorry, I'm laughing. This is insane. Like this is exactly what I was talking about. The fact that there's people who were completely clueless.
She, in fact, at that time, I had an email account, but the Justice Department did not have email yet. So my email account was actually at the National Computer Security Agency at the NSA. And the head of the National Computer Security Agencies, their chief scientist for cybercrime or cybersecurity, was a guy named Robert Morris, who was the father of the guy I was prosecuting.
No. Wow. What are the odds?
And so what we did there is we were very fortunate because we got people in information security who were also professors, Keith Bostick, Gene Spafford, and they were able to literally step down from the witness stand, and I mean that literally, to a chalkboard and start explaining what the finger demon was, what SendMail was, how the internet works, what TCP/IP was. And they were talking to people. The jury was in Syracuse, New York, and they were talking to people who were, normal people off the street who had zero experience in computers.
About TCP/IP?
About TCP/IP.
That is crazy. That's like the learning curve around that, just to get this somebody, even today, somebody who's done schooling and is in this space to understand the OSI layer and all and SendMail and with protocols and handshakes and encryption.
Just
all
what
of that.
a protocol is.
Yes, I mean it's incredible that you had to go through that
But
explanation
it's
before,
not,
right?
if you think about it, let's say you were trying a case involving a bridge collapse. You would have engineers talking about
Right.
metallurgy and metal fatigue and all that stuff. So it is always the job of a lawyer in these cases to educate the jury sufficiently to understand the issues. And the thing is, again, what you want to focus on is, even if you talk about it as computer crime, you want to focus on the crime part, not the computer part. So get the jury to understand that, and in my case, in the Morris case, this was really the electronic equivalent of joyriding. He was just trying to see whether it could be done. He had no evil intent. He had no malicious intent. He had no intent to cause harm.
And Mark, that was almost if you're looking back at the initial crimes, that was pretty typical. There were a lot of hackers, quote unquote, initial hackers that were doing it just for the sake of see if it can be done, and maybe get some notoriety, like just somebody to recognize them in that community, right?
And not even notoriety.
Mhm.
This was, so there are really various generations of hacking. The first era of hacking was basically from the inception of computers in the late 40s to the early 80s. And these hackers were literally experimenters, okay? Tinkerers. They were trying to see what happens if I do this, and can I break it, and can I fix it, and all that stuff. And it was a very small community. And these were and Robert Morris's father fit into that pattern. He went to Harvard, and he worked for Bell Labs, and that's what they did. They took stuff apart, they broke it, they fixed it, things like that. And the thing about it is, you couldn't cause all that much damage because you didn't have an internet. You had a very basic rudimentary internet, which was basically used for, not even for file sharing or information sharing, it was for resource sharing. That was the main use of the internet. So that was basically from 1949 to say 1980. From 1980 to 1991, you had a mix of experimenters, these same kind of ideas. Let me see what I can do. But you also had people who were stealing money, who were stealing access. So you did have people who were committing crimes through the internet.
Wow, all the way back then. That's amazing, Mark.
You had corporate espionage on the internet. You had real espionage on the internet. You had denial of service attacks on the internet. These are all the kinds of things of what can I do. Then 1991 comes, and what you end up with is what I call e-commerce types crimes. And these include massive thefts of credit card numbers, massive thefts of personal data, and the like. And then we move on to the next generation, which is social media types of crimes. And now we're in crypto crimes. And crypto crimes where the attack is directly to the victim and the money demand is directly to the victim. So instead of stealing something and trying to sell it, stealing personal data and trying to sell it, now I lock something up and give you and sell you back the key.
Yeah, and the reason they did that is because, Mark, they realized that the people that care most about your data is you.
My mom used to teach in the South Bronx, and occasionally she would come out to her car and the battery was stolen. And there was some 14-year-old kid offering to sell her a battery, which looked phenomenally like the battery that was just inside of her car. And he'd sell it to her for $10. Well, you can't get a battery for $10. So she'd pay the $10 to get the battery back. And she needed a battery. Perfect supply and demand. Well, that's what crypto is.
So what's next, Mark? So we covered this fascinating history, and it's fascinating to talk to you that you had to do a lot of the heavy lifting, because I'm assuming that some of these cases you worked on are now being used still today, as an outcome. So they can build upon that. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. And there's already some outcomes for these trials. So what's next? I mean, we're looking at as you mentioned, ransomware is kind of the next iteration. What's coming next? Are we, and this is still going on prolifically. I mean, there's how many companies are being hacked on a regular basis? It's like
all of them.
Yeah, all of them every hour, or like this. I don't know what the statistics are, but it's insane.
So what we're seeing now is a couple of other things. In addition to the ransomware, some of the biggest trends right now are extortionware, privacy invasion as a service. All right. And we're going to see a lot more false personation type crimes, because what's happening now is that deep fakes for both voice and face are becoming fast enough that I can now authenticate to you using my voice. I can call you. I can now pick up the phone, call somebody with your voice.
Yeah.
I can now enter a video conference with your face and your voice in real time. And this is only going to get more. So we're going to have to now build up different layers of authentication. And one of the problems with authentication is that when you have strong authentication, you have strong attribution and you have weak privacy, because everything you do is now attributed to you. And so you can track everything that you have done. And so we have to have this balance between anonymity, the ability to be anonymous, but accountability. And one of the problems we have in information security, and it's always been this way, is that the reason we have trouble with information security is because we ask it to do, in many cases, completely opposite things. We want strong encryption. We want nobody to be able to get to my data. We want a key that only I have. But if something happens to me, somebody else can get in there. We want strong encryption. But if somebody uses that strong encryption to lock my data, we want to be able to unlock it in a ransomware situation. We want a database
versus
right.
usability versus security. It's always been the case, right?
Well, another example is in one of the solutions to ransomware is to have strong and frequent backups. Great. So now we have two databases we have to protect, two networks that we have to secure, two networks we have to monitor, and a weakness in either of them results in theft or loss of data.
Wow. And you mentioned the kind of the deep fake and the ability to impersonate you. The issues with that is just like with identity theft, which is so difficult to prove later on that it wasn't you that, basically created took out $350,000 mortgage. Because throughout the process they authenticated you, basically saying, okay, that's the person that's taking out the mortgage. How do you think we're going to solve that problem in this industry that, again, it's moving so quickly, and we're relying so heavily now on digital communications?
Well, so some form of PKI where we have digital signatures that are authenticated strongly with maybe even a biometric on one end. I don't want a database of biometrics, but one of the things that's happening now in the mortgage industry now, with home prices being going up and people buying and selling houses for that reason, is that the hackers will get in. Let's say you're buyer, seller, broker, right? The hackers will get in and fake the emails between the two of them. And what they'll do is they'll get to the form called the HUD-1, the closing document. And all they'll do is alter the wire transfer instructions. Everything else will be the same. The wire transfer instructions will be different. And nobody memorizes wire transfer instructions. And we see that going on in crypto wallets as well. They get in, they change the wallet. There was a kid in England who had a scam where he corrupted the cut and paste buffer. And since nobody memorizes crypto wallets, what people would do is when they saw a crypto wallet number, they would cut it and paste it into the transfer instructions. So when you cut it, it would wipe it out, and when you paste it, it would paste his wallet in there.
And the number is so long that people don't necessarily even look at it, and they just see like a bunch of kind of gibberish numbers, and they they don't realize it's a different number.
So people were wire transferring money into his crypto wallet.
Wow. And the problem is, we need, in order for us to continue commerce and transactions and have a usable, World Wide Web, we need to have ability for us to authenticate without benefit of the doubt. Like we have to have strong authentication. There's no two ways about it. All transaction relies on trust, right?
Well, But we also have to remember that we can authenticate to identity, or we can authenticate to authority. And those are different things. So we use identity as a proxy for authority. All right. So, for many of the transactions I engage in, there is no need for the other party to know who I am. They just need to know that I'm authorized. So if I'm making a purchase of a digital good, it's not necessary that they know who I am. And one of the things we see with what's going on in Ukraine and the like is that we don't have backups. And I don't mean we don't have backups of data and things like that. We don't have backup infrastructures. We put all our chips into digital. So I probably have in the house $50 in cash. If I needed to get cash, I would have to go authenticate myself to a machine and get cash. I don't use cash very much anymore. So everything has become digital. I don't have, my desk is stacked with papers, but almost everything I have is online, which means an attack to that is an attack to everything that I have.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, companies still want to know your identity, and because they're going to say, well, hold on for a second, how are we going to market to you? What else are we going to sell to you? So that's the problem. Like, that's why they want to know, the more they know about you, the better they can monetize you, and
Yep.
and you become an asset.
So there was a case just the other day out of Richmond, Virginia, involving what's called a geofence warrant. Guy robbed a bank, and the police didn't know who he was, so they went out and they got what's called a geofence warrant within 500 yards of the bank for 20 minutes before and 20 minutes after the robbery. Actually, for 1 hour, they want to know the identity of from Google every person who was located in that area. And there were 19 people, and based on the 19, they were able to figure out who the person was because they were able to get, where they drove to. And they drove home. And then they looked up the tax records of who owned that place, and they were able to figure out who it was, right?
Amazing.
So
note to self: turn on the Google's, location services.
Well,
before you do anything.
What was interesting about it is that how many different ways Google collects your location. And if it's not Google, then it's going to be Sprint or T-Mobile or AT&T or Verizon. Okay? And if it's not them, it's some app that you have. And location services tell people not only where you are, but who you're with. You can infer what you're talking about. If you pinpoint their location at an AIDS clinic or at a church, you can figure out what religion they are. And all of this data is being collected and all these inferences being made so that you don't have to pay for Google. That's why Google is free, because you are the product. So coming up with questions about what rights do people have to privacy? So for example, if you use Google as your GPS, you opt in to allow Google to collect your location so you can drive. You have to have location services turned on if you want to use Google Maps. Otherwise it's useless. But what do they collect? What are their collection practices? You really only want them to know where you are right now, and as soon as you finish driving there, delete it. But that's not what happens.
Yeah, it's definitely not what happens. And I encourage people you can go on Google and ask to create like a repository, like of all the information they have on you. And it's incredible. If you do that, just the sheer size of the files are like, gigabytes, terabytes in size.
But even if you're just looking at your location data, I've gone back and I've tried to delete it. It is not an easy thing to delete it from everywhere, because various applications of Google collect your location in different ways and for different reasons. And the other thing about it is, I do criminal law cases as well. And I can't tell you how many times I have a case right now involving a guy who allegedly committed a robbery of a Best Buy in upstate Maryland. Okay. And his Google stuff shows that he was in Virginia 150 miles away. So sometimes this stuff can protect you as well.
Yeah. And isn't it also true that it's not just the Google location services? It's even, let's say your phone has a Wi-Fi turn on. Every time they're trying to communicate to an access point, that access point can potentially just, take track, notice of, what was trying to connect to it. And so, as you mentioned, it's not just the location. There are just so many different ways that this can be tracked. So like Bluetooth, for example, that also is promiscuous.
Sure.
It's like, broadcast that you're there, and the devices that are, attached to it or looking for this Bluetooth connection can also keep track of that identity or like that device trying to connect. So there's just so many different ways.
I'll give you an example. I have the little Apple tracker thing hidden in my bicycle, so don't try to steal my bike. And I've actually put it inside the tube of the bike, so you can't even see it. But when you think about it, there's this tiny little thing the size of a flat battery. You say, well, wait a second. How does that connect to the internet? And how does it get GPS location where it is? And the answer is it doesn't. What it does is it's pinging other devices. So my little tracking device, if you're walking by my bike, your phone with your access to your internet and your geolocation is what my device is using to ping back to the internet where it is. So we're also sharing this data.
Yeah. And, some people would say, well, what do I care? I have nothing to hide. You probably heard that before.
That's a
Mark.
very common thing to say. And the truth is that's true 99% of the time. It's that 1% of the time look, let's say you deduct your car as a business expense. A couple of keystrokes, IRS says, you know what? We've tracked where you're going, and 40% of the time you're going to the grocery store. Boom. Not only deduction disallowed, you go to jail. Okay. The point about privacy isn't that you're hiding something, that you're concealing something from the public. The point about privacy is what allows you to be yourself, do things without fear of retribution for the most part. It's not absolute, and it should never be absolute. But it also gives you the ability to screw up.
Yeah. And Mark, I would point out as well that circumstances change. So things you may not consider being intrusion to your privacy and mean nothing to you right now, 2-3 years from now can make a big difference because circumstances change in your private life and things that happen, and all of a sudden, and this data does not go away. There are things that get posted on Craigslist 20 years, and it's being offloaded to some secondary server, and it's still there.
Look, you have people who have revenge porn, and you want to be open and frank with people. So a lot of the attacks are based on invasions of privacy. Revenge porn is one kind. If you remember the Sony hack, what was published was their emails among each other talking about what they thought about movie stars and things like that. It was very embarrassing. This idea that people need to live their lives in a public space and with public scrutiny is an adjustment. Look at China, where they have facial recognition. You can say, well, I have nothing to hide. The flip side of that is it's none of their business.
Yeah. And the question is, are we going to that point where we're going to be there as well? I mean, we're, and not to bring out the, some of the, the vaccine, passports. I mean, all of that is becoming, we're getting tracked on a lot of different bases. And then, Mark, the 5G, the idea of having these antennas everywhere, like in a very prolific manner, like now you get tracked from not just, the proximity, I think is way more accurate because the number of devices are out there. And they can really track you down to do you remember Mark, when GPS just came out? I don't know if you recall that, but there's only way for you to get an accurate enough GPS was through military sources because they deemed it. So, where I'm going with
correct.
This, right?
That's right. I mean, GPS, we had a deliberately dumbed down GPS.
Correct.
And that was because we considered not your location to be so sensitive, but the technology that allowed us to know the location to be so sensitive. And what most people don't understand about GPS is, by its nature, GPS does not collect data about the user. GPS does not require the user to transmit anything back. You can have completely passive GPS, because the way GPS works is the satellites are broadcasting what time it is. And because of the speed of light, depending on the distance of the satellites, that signal reaches any point in space at a particular time. So by doing what's called triangulation, you say, okay, I'm exactly 1.4 seconds from that satellite, 1.1 second from that satellite, 2.2 seconds from that satellite. There's only one place on Earth that meets those requirements. And so now, because of what I am receiving from the satellites, I now know where I am. Nobody else knows where I am. I know where I am because of what I have received. The problem is, I now have to translate those numbers into a map. So now what I do is I go onto the internet through Google Maps or whatever, and I say, give me a map of Washington, D.C. with me in the center of it. Now, essentially, Google I give them this data and they give me the map.
And there used to be many companies that provided that data, but not anymore, right? Is also a correct statement?
Well, no, I mean, the answer actually is exactly the opposite.
Okay.
There used to be lots of companies that provide that mapping service.
Right.
Now there are lots and lots of companies that take advantage of my GPS data to know where I am. And one of the interesting things about privacy is, in many ways, we have too few choices, and in many ways, we have too many choices. So, for example, I went to the Daily News website on my phone, and it says, this website would like to use your location. Yes or no? I don't know. Why do you want to use it? What are you going to do with it? How long are you going to keep it? Who are you going to share it with? How do I opt out? So I don't have a problem if the Daily News uses my location so that the ads that are delivered to me from the Daily News reflect Bethesda, Maryland, and not Brooklyn. But I do have a problem.
They do that for most retailers as well, right?
Yes.
So most online retailers always ask you, right? It's not just the Daily News.
So we make it a binary decision, yes or no, or while using the app, while not using the app. And in a sense, it's a much more granular decision. But who's got the time to make those decisions? Who's got the energy or the resources to do it? So we end up either defaulting to yes, you may, or no, you may not, when what we really mean to say is it depends.
But then it was a time, let's say they said, okay, tell me more, right? There's another button beside it, tell me more. And then all of a sudden, it's going to be a whole 5-page document explaining exactly what the policy is.
So there is a way to do browser-based privacy. And what it is my browser asks me a bunch of questions about my privacy settings. What do you want? Okay. And I put into my browser what my general privacy preferences are for different services and stuff. And then when I go to a site, it either puts those privacy preferences into the site, blocks the site if it doesn't meet my privacy preferences, or says, hey, listen, this site doesn't comport with your privacy preferences because it does this. Is it okay to proceed? And that way, the computer makes the decisions for me based on my preferences.
Yeah, and you know how that works because there's all these exceptions. And then now, for example, if you look at the app ecosystem, right? How many apps are there that they just collect, massive amount of services information, despite the fact that they may not need it. Even a calculator you download has request your location and your contact information, even though it's just a calculator.
Exactly.
App.
And so we need to have some regulation as well as to what is appropriate data collection and stuff. And all this, it goes back to security. The other day I was at a hospital, and I walk into the hospital, and right at the reception area, they say, we need your driver's license. I go, why? So, well, it's for security. And I said, well, what are you checking it against? They said, nothing. I said, then how could that possibly be security? Second of all, if I was a patient here and I didn't have a driver's license, could I not come in? Oh, no, we'll let you in even without a driver's license. I said, okay. So now you've got my driver's license, and you scan this in, so you know that I came in here. So now you've created essentially a HIPAA record because it's a hospital. You know that a person came in as a patient, and you know what department they're going to. So if it's psychiatry or whatever, you have to have a patient record that is separate and apart from the patient records kept by the hospital.
And Mark, they do this all the time. Like how many times, and I love this about you because you basically say, you pause and you ask the question, why? And I think that's, if people do that more, even that would it will help out in terms of,
but the answer ultimately was, number one, we don't know why. We don't know what we're doing with the data. And if you want to come in here, you better give your driver's license. So just shrug your shoulders and just go ahead.
But how many times you go to the doctor's office and they give you this long form of like your past employers, your preferences for, I mean, it's just a million questions, and all you want to do is just get, get some, or just something very simple.
I need an antibiotic. That's it.
Yeah, and just something very simple. But they know if you sit down and fill it out for 25 minutes, they know everything about you, and you don't know where these forms go. And these are mom and pop sometimes of doctor's office. They don't have the security controls. Right. I can just imagine there's a little.
Well, first of all, why are we doing this on paper in the first place?
Yeah, well, because they just don't. I guess for security reasons, they want to keep it.
No, it's because they didn't bother to invest in it. But even companies that large hospitals that use electronic patient records, when you walk in, they hand you a clipboard.
Yeah. Yeah,
but we're still in a transition phase. I mean, we still have paper records and things as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And I absolutely love this conversation, Mark. You first of all, this conversation was completely unscripted, and Mark, you just know so much about so much. It doesn't matter what I throw it at you. Like you just go dive right, deep into the conversation, into the technical aspect of it, the private security and so on. And I would love to do this again and maybe dissect other topics.
I'd be glad to. I'd love to talk to you about cryptocurrency. I'd love to talk to you about
we have
ransomware and that.
So many things we can dissect. But until then, what's the easiest way for people to reach out to you? And we'll definitely do this again. We'll dissect some of the past stories as well as some. So I'm going to give you
two email addresses which are able to reach me easily. The first one is at the law firm of Corman, Jackson, and Krantz, which is mdr@kjk.com. All right. And the other one is my personal email, which I check much more frequently, which is mdrasch, that's RASCH, @gmail.
Okay, perfect. Mark, thank you very much for joining us today. I much appreciate it. It was a fascinating conversation. And until then, for all those who joined, thank you very much, and stay safe online as well as offline. Take care, all.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.